Movement Foundations. So let's discuss an easy way to think about movement from a patterning standpoint. Um, in general, many of you probably know this, but when we set out to build exercise prescription for folks, we want to make sure that we're balancing joint action. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Sometimes we may have come out of school and we're really thinking planes of motion and joint action and making sure that we're balancing out those planes of motion and joint action. Um, it's a little bit easier to think of patterns a little bit more simply and say, well, geez, the human body can do a bunch of things functionally. The human body can push, and we obviously have experiences of that in the gym, but certainly out in life, we push things, right? We can push things more vertically or more horizontally and have it more oriented in those positions, maybe in between as well. But we typically will call these a vertical push and a horizontal push. We pull things. We vertically pull and we horizontally pull, and we also hang. And so that's one where we probably don't do a lot of hang work, but from a grip strength standpoint, that's actually a really great thing to work on hanging. We also hip hinge. So that is, breaking at the waist with a more vertical tibia. That's our deadlift position. And that actually helps to, it's a more athletic position. It allows us to put less stress on our back and knees, and should be a pattern that most of us do. Many of you know, working with a lot of clients that sit down a lot, they're great at squatting. They're terrible at hip hinging. We have to teach them that. Speaking of squatting, so obviously there is squatting. We have bilateral squat, which would be two legs, and then we have unilateral squat, which will obviously be our lunge variations. We then carry. We can carry things as human beings, and we can rotate. Pause here on rotation. When we think about training rotation, we need to think about what joints, according to FMS, need to maintain rotational ability. What are the ball and sockets, right? The hips and the shoulders. So active straight leg raise and shoulder mobility and thoracic rotation need to be maintained. If those things are not maintained, it comes at the expense of other joints that are not designed to be maintained. And Lee spoke about that in the corrective exercise module. And so we want to make sure that can shoulders move through their normal range of motion? Can hips move pretty adequately? Does thoracic spine rotate? Do scapula protract, retract, upward, elevate, downward, elevate, depress, and upward rotate, downward rotate? Do they do the things they're supposed to be doing when we're coaching this movement? So rotation happens, but what we often will see in the gym is that folks will rotate. They'll just grab a cable machine and they'll start just rotating through the spine. Usually it's the thoracic lumbar junction. You'll see a lot of movement through there. What you really want to see is hips moving, spine stabilizing, like we see in the golf swing here, thoracic spine rotation. But you see that the spine maintains relative neutral, that it's really the hips that are rotating, thoracic spine, and to some extent the shoulders. And then finally, we have our floor ground pattern. So anything that you do on the ground, that could include core work, direct core work, obviously your get-ups, sitting, standing, obviously your crawl variations. So I wanted to touch upon this great squat photo here, right? So we've got a gentleman here doing an overhead squat, unilateral overhead squat with a kettlebell. Looks pretty good, right? And remember, and I don't know if folks remember this, but I see this quite a bit in facilities across the country. It's just sort of one of those things that's been around forever. We always talk about, or we've always heard, the knee should not go past the toe when they squat. And that is not accurate. There actually is no evidence that says knees should not go past the toes or that it's contraindicated. That was made up, in particular, especially for group fitness. But there's some historical articles in Sports Illustrated that talked about, it was entitled, "The Knee is Not Made for Bending." For those of you that work in Southern California and your VP is Seath Manetti, this is one of Seath's favorite stories, but this article was written by a strength coach and a doctor who made a big crusade of saying, hey, knee should only go parallel. Well, if you only go parallel, the knee won't translate forward. But normal range of motion in the ankle is about, 18 degrees. So we should be able to get that knee past the toe. And in fact, with the FMS screen, you're able to assess ankle mobility because we'll see a lot of folks have poor ankle range of motion. So if they don't have requisite ankle range of motion, they're probably not going to, the knee's not going to translate forward, or the tibia is not going to translate forward nearly as well as it should. The deal is, as long as your foot stays fully grounded, i.e. toes, midfoot, and heels stay flat, and you're maintaining obviously an arch, that is totally fine. That lines up the femur, the mid-femur, to absorb most of the shear force. And you can see in this gentleman, he's got a nice straight line from his fist all the way through his ear, through his mid-trunk, right through about his mid-femur into the lateral malleolus, or the ankle bone. He's got a nice straight line, and that's where the force is going through. Now, if he tips forward and goes towards his toes and his heels start to pop up, and we see this quite a bit, people may not have the ankle range of motion, and so they have to adjust to do the exercise so that they don't fall over. They'll let their heels raise up. Well, that creates all of that force, that shear that's going right through the middle of the femur is now shifting anteriorly towards the knee, and this increases shear on the knee. So this can be a recipe for potential knee injury, especially if there's a history. So we really want to make sure that all of our clients have requisite ankle range of motion, that they're maintaining neutral spine, which this gentleman is doing when they squat, and they're able to allow their knee to go wherever it naturally goes. Not everyone will go that far forward, but for those folks that do, it's totally okay.